We are Myth Vision, home of Myth Vision Radio and Myth Vision Podcast. My co-host is Derek Lambert. I'm Dr. Luther G. Williams. And if you've been following us on Facebook, you've seen the promos, the teasers, the memes, the talking points that tell you that today is a very special show on Myth Vision. We're about to give you the whole enchilada, so set the table. But right now, Derek's got some important information to share with you. Derek?
You know, you're absolutely right, Luther. You know, Myth Vision is committed to bringing you the very best research and researchers in religion and culture on the world scene today. Doctor, next month, Myth Vision podcast host Dr. Robert Eisenman, which actually is right here at the beginning of January. So he's right around the corner. He is the author of The Brother of Jesus, James the Just and His Mission. There's a lot more planned for you. The Myth Vision website with our Facebook groups, YouTube links, PayPal, Patreon. Partner with us. All these things will be in the description. They'll be available to you. They might even pop up on the screen. Who knows? Magically. Haha. So we're going to have explorers, researchers, scientists, scholars, mystics, historians, heretics, all of the alike, and of course your input in engaging our guest. So come check us out on Facebook at Myth Vision Radio Group and Myth Vision Podcast page. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, share this so you don't miss a show. Hit that bell, if you will. We're asking for your participation, your contribution, your support in helping Myth Vision to continue bringing you the very finest programming. Our PayPal accounts, Patreon accounts, and whatnot, once again, they're on your screen. So please contribute, donate whatever you can. No amount is too small. Won't you partner with us at Myth Vision? Luther, I'm very excited about today's show. Would you please tell us about our very special guest?
I'm as excited as you are, Derek. Our guest today is James S. Valiant. He and Warren Fay have co-authored a book entitled Creating Christ, How Roman Emperors Invented Christianity. And James is on our show. He's a native of Los Angeles, California. He has a degree in philosophy from New York University and a Juris Doctorate from the University of San Diego, where he was also an instructor of law. For more than 17 years, James was a deputy district attorney for the county of San Diego, where he prosecuted high-profile murder, rape, and child molest cases. He's the author of a 2005 book called The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, and that's a work that included never-before-seen material from her unpublished private journals, and he did that with the cooperation of the controversial author's estate. Now, James has spent the last 35 years or so studying ancient history, biblical texts, and archaeology, and that's how we'll engage him today. The book he'll be talking about is Creating Christ, How Roman Emperors Invented Christianity. That's the result. He's in Southern California with his wife of 22 years. Her name is Holly, and the couple created an award-winning television interview program called Ideas in Action. Sounds interesting. So when you go to their website, creatingchrist.com, it opens to a quote from the eminent Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, Dr. Robert Eisenman, whom you mentioned, Derek, we're going to have on the show shortly. And Dr. Eisenman praises this book, Creating Christ. I'd like to share that quote because Dr. Eisenman is going to be our guest on January 3rd, so all of this fits together quite nicely. He writes, I have rarely encountered a book so original, exciting, accessible, and informed on subjects that are of obvious importance to the world and to which I have myself devoted such a large part of my scholarly career studying. This is a work, talking about Creating Christ, of outstanding and original scholarship. Its arguments are a brilliant, profound, and thorough integration of the relevant evidence. When they are done, the conclusion is inescapable and obviously profound. Well, Derek and I certainly share Professor Eisenman's sentiments about this book because when you finish reading it, you get the impression that no stone was left unturned, no shred of evidence was left unexamined. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we present to you James S. Valiant. James, welcome to Myth Vision.
Wow. Well, thank you very, very much. I'm quite flattered. That was quite an introduction. Thank you, sir.
Oh, just very realistic. We know you're going to thrill us because we've got hours and hours of talking points. So let's get right into it, shall we?
Please.
Your book deals with the Roman provenance of Christianity, and by provenance, not everybody may be familiar with that word. It just means the origins, that Christianity is rooted in the Romans, and ancient Rome had quite a special attitude toward people that they conquered, didn't they? When Rome battled the militant Jews, I noticed in the Bible it talks about the Roman armies. Just as an interesting point, it doesn't say army singular; it says armies plural, which indicates that Rome was able to unite these conquered people. They had an interesting relationship with the people they conquered, didn't they? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, Rome, of course, is famous for being the most enduring and long-lasting of the ancient empires. And they did that certainly through great military conquest. They had an awesome military machine, obviously, that was no match for most of the people that they came across. But it was also because of a sort of political genius and a political openness that they had. Compared to, they had nothing like freedom of religion as we do in the West today. Compared to the ancient world, they had a comparatively open policy toward other religions. You can read inscriptions to Roman deities side by side with local deities throughout their vast empire, from Scotland to Syria, from Spain to the Black Sea, from Egypt to France. Local deities and Roman deities were worshipped side by side. In many famous instances, the Romans were, of course, famous for being cultural sponges. Most famously, they adopted the Greek religion, associating the Greek gods almost one for one with their own. And as time wore on, they imported religions from Asia Minor, like the Great Mother, Egyptian religion. Serapis and Isis had temples in Rome itself. Over time, Mithras, became imported from the Parthians. And of course, each time they would give it a Roman flavor, but they were happy to absorb foreign religions. And with other polytheistic religions, of course, that presented no problem whatever. Unlike the Persians, who allowed independence among their conquered people, and unlike the Greeks, who sort of imposed it or superimposed Greek philosophy after Alexander the Great on all their conquered lands, the Romans sort of absorbed the cultures and the religions of the people they conquered. They offered citizenship and eventual membership in the Senate to people eventually from all over the empire. And so this sort of flexibility and social mobility and absorption of foreign cultures helped them to last for so many centuries.
James, that's fascinating that you bring up how they would conquer their people. They would create their own version of their religion. And it seems you're leading that way in this book to suggest the evidence is pointing, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm giving a sneak peek. The evidence is pointing that they did this to the Jews after they conquered them and they'd fully made this conquest occur. By 70 AD, it seems that they had established a Roman Judaism, and this is what we are calling Christianity. And many people would say, well, yeah, of course, Derek, duh. Later on, Rome hijacked this thing, and the first century, in the first century, was actually Jewish Christianity, and they were the ones who were persecuted, and later down the road, Rome did this. You're saying that Rome's philosophy of conquest took place in the New Testament is not just this Jewish thing. It is Rome's Judaism. Am I right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's precisely correct. Most people are familiar with the fact that Christianity would eventually become the religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine would open himself up to it, become friendly to it after his vision in the sky. His mother became a total Christian, and he opened Rome up to making itself the Christian empire. But what people are less familiar with is that this can be found all the way back in the New Testament itself, in the very oldest Christian literature and archaeology. You're right. We have, the Romans respected the antiquity of Eastern religions. We have Roman versions of Greek, Egyptian, Phrygian, even Parthian religions. We should expect to find a Roman version of Judaism. But where is it? What is it? If it's not Christianity, remarkably, it's sort of a lacuna, a gap in the record if we don't have some form, as you point out, of Roman Judaism, because that would have been their practice, to sort of get the foreign gods on their side and to integrate the people culturally into their empire. So it served both a religious and a cultural purpose that sort of politically made the empire more cohesive. Now, Judaism presented a unique problem, of course, because they were monotheists. They couldn't just go along with the perfunctory worship of Roman state deities like nearly every other polytheistic culture could. All they had to do was, give a perfunctory nod to the Roman gods like they gave to their many local polytheistic gods. But, of course, the Jewish religion has strict rules about worshiping other gods, making idols or graven images, and any religious act in association with those rituals. And so the Romans at first had to sort of create an exception for the Jewish people. They were exempted from the worship of Roman state gods, and in their homeland of Judea, they were allowed to enforce their own Mosaic law before the Jewish War, before 70 AD. That all came, of course, to a screeching end with the cataclysmic Jewish War of 66 to 71 AD.
Now, James, this is fascinating. So the Romans had a strategy that incorporated what we might call hard conquest and soft conquest. The hard conquest,
both at once.
Yeah, both at once, right? Because they could be brutal. Now, we're not saying that the Romans were any less militaristic and brutal in the things that many people think of when they think of
they
Rome.
were no Boy Scouts. No.
Yeah,
they crucified their traitors. Yes.
Exactly. So on the other hand, they have the Gospels, which is a backup strategy. And that was important also to conquest. I am mindful of the Iraqi war and the extinguishing of the intellectual class. The fact that if you want to be a conqueror, you go after the thinkers, even in modern times. Okay, those are the people that you seek out among those you desire to conquer. Okay, the Romans did the same thing.
One of the most horrible incidents from our own time is, of course, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. People merely for wearing glasses were taken out and executed.
Right, right. So isn't it fascinating that this is the target? Now, we have had on this show Dr. John Lundwall, and he talks about primary literate cultures, and oral cultures. In Judea, at this time, about 2,000 years ago, to have an oral influenced literate culture, I would say from my studies of what Dr. Lundwall says, roughly 20 to 40% of the population could read. Right. So that's the percentage that could be influenced by the gospel. You didn't you didn't have to fight against those. 20 to 40% roughly could read. And so those are the ones that the Romans really went after. They were valuable to the Romans, weren't they?
The Jewish religion, because it places so much emphasis on the Torah and the Word of God, and notice this goes all the way back to Genesis. God's very creation mechanism is His Word. God said, "Let there be light." And the Torah itself was brought down from Mount Sinai by Moses, carved by the hand of God, and told straight from God to Moses. And so the Word of God, and consider the role of prophecy. Jesus is seen himself in the Messiah by the first century as the prophecies made flesh, made real. And the importance, you can even see it in modern Judaism when they place the phylacteries, the prayers themselves, the words, attach them to their forehead, to their body, as a way of prayer. The word is so important to Judaism and has always been, and they were remarkably literate. In the ancient world, that's extremely remarkable to have such a literate culture. The Roman society, the Greco-Roman society, was literate, but even more so the Jewish culture. If you were a seriously religious Jewish male, you would have to learn Hebrew, just as Jewish males do at bar mitzvah today.
Look, just going in, because there's so many layers to this book as I've been reading, I'm extremely fascinated how well and smooth, and you've made it so, you've simplified a complex idea in a complex history, and you've simplified it. So something I want to touch on is the Messianic Jews, the separatist philosophy of society that they had. I mean, these guys were xenophobic, they were racist, their law prohibited them from doing particular activities, particular foods, particular times in which they would celebrate certain things. They can't do so many things. What would they, I mean, can you go into something about their laws, their way in society, what set them apart, what triggered the Romans, what, rabbit trail a little bit into that and the separatist concept of the Jews of the first century?
Well, consider monotheism as a religion vis-a-vis polytheistic world that it's living in. It's our God, and it's only our God. It's a national statement. It's an ethnic statement. We are God's chosen people. From the beginning in Genesis, God says, circumcise your males, and that way you'll know physically them apart from everyone else. And so this was the separation of God's special chosen people from everyone else. And the whole history, the legendary history in the Hebrew scripture, is how Hebrew kings would be influenced by foreign wives or foreign religion, and that would lead to their downfall. That is how the fall of Israel is explained. That is how the fall of Judea and Jerusalem is explained. And so when they return from exile, it becomes particularly intense. When Ezra and Nehemiah build the second temple, they become very strict Torah observant, very strict monotheists, and in fact they exclude foreign wives and foreign marriage from all the returning Jews to Jerusalem. So it was nationalistic, it was ethnic, it was concerned with lineage, and it was strictly concerned with the Mosaic Law, and they regarded their strict form of monotheism as requiring a strict form of practice. And they believed that, especially after the conquests of Alexander the Great, all of these new Greek ideas were foreign pollution, were corrupting their pure form of monotheism. And in the 2nd century BC, they rebelled against Greek influence, throughout the Syrian conquerors of Jerusalem, purified, their temple, and could worship again their own special monotheistic God and reject the entire religious world around them. And the same attitude can be seen brought right into the Roman world, the revolution that they brought in the Roman world. Now, many readers, you have to take a pause here, what a lot of Christians don't appreciate fully, and this really is the key to our whole book, and the lesson we would scream out to the world of biblical scholars. What needs to be taken into account is this cataclysmic war that occurred in the 1st century. It cost up to 1 million lives. It certainly enslaved tens of thousands more. It reduced the famous Jewish temple in the year 70 AD to the Wailing Wall that it is today, and the Jews so still venerate today. That war was absolutely cataclysmic to the psychology of the Hebrew people, and it was cataclysmic in Roman history. And the war, according to 1st century Jewish historians, tell us that the war was principally motivated by religion, by specifically the messianic prophecies found in Hebrew scriptures that were by then hundreds of years old. In those prophecies, a political military deliverer is prophesied to come liberate Israel, so to permit them their exclusive form of monotheistic worship. So there were many messiahs in this rebellion in the first century, people who claimed to be the chosen one of God who would lead Israel to national independence and their strict observance of Torah. And that was what the Romans were facing in the first century. What we see in Christianity is clearly, when you put it back into its first century context, take it out of its 21st century religious context and back into the first century context in which it was written, it becomes quite obvious that the New Testament is a loud, clear, consistent message against the Messianic Jews that the Romans were so violently contending with in the first and second centuries, because still a second religious rebellion would break out among Jews against Romans in the early second century, which we also know is messianic in nature.
So to break this down and to reemphasize, the key to Jewish society, ancient Jewish society, was Jewish religion. And the key to Jewish religion was their writings. They were people of the book. You know,
right.
these Deuteronomists who were in charge of Jewish society in the post-exilic time, and they had their scribal schools, and the scribal schools were all important. They fought over what lines were going to go in and what phrases were going to be carried forward and what things were going to be excised and redacted. And so
the entire Talmudic tradition carries that on. It's the Talmudic rabbinic tradition is this marvelous intellectual tradition of debating the meaning of Torah. And it's not so much what the meaning of Torah is, but coming to terms with, debating it, getting our minds as best as we can around the infinite mind of God. That's Jewish tradition, even to this day.
Yes, it is. So, okay, so what, I have to ask, what gave you the idea, James, for this book, this idea about Roman provenance of Christianity? Were there other works on this subject existing before your book came along?
I'd heard of none. This was back in the early 1980s. In 1983, the first is when it first occurred to me. Now, my own background had perfectly prepared me for this. As a child, I was taken to church by religiously liberal and somewhat ecumenical or skeptical parents, but I was taken to church as a child, and I took it very seriously. I read deeply Christian literature, the Bible itself, practically memorized the New Testament, even when I was just a child. This sort of concerned my parents, but I was very, very serious. I developed reading more and more, frankly, more and more about the Bible, biblical criticism. Frankly, philosophers, too, gave me criticism not just of the history of Christianity, but the ethics of Christianity. I read like Friedrich Nietzsche, and I didn't buy the whole of Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas, but I knew he had a radically different perspective about Christian ethics. You know, Friedrich Nietzsche hated Christianity as only the son of a Lutheran minister could really hate Christianity. But his God is dead, and Christianity is a slave religion. I'm not sure I ever bought Nietzsche's philosophy, but he gave me a new perspective on questioning Christianity as moral idealism. So between my dense reading of Christianity, my sort of moral liberation from Christian ethics, and then combined, like you said, I was a prosecutor with all that forensic training, being able to investigate facts and just, infer the truth behind it. All of that combined, I was sitting in the downtown LA library reading Josephus, and I was reading Josephus's claims that his boss, the Roman general Vespasian, an uncircumcised pagan's pagan, was in fact the Jewish Messiah. And I was reading this from a Jewish historian who I knew was writing propaganda for the Flavians. And so it occurred to me that, of course, each of the three synoptics, Jesus predicts that the glorious coming of the Son of Man in power and glory would happen within the lifetimes of his listeners. Some 40 years after his prediction, of course, the Jewish temple was destroyed, just as Jesus himself had associated the glorious coming of the Son of Man with. And so I thought, well, this would make a perfect prediction for the propagandistic claims of Vespasian that were reported by Josephus. That connection was made by me way back in '83, and I got so excited by the possibility that the Gospels were themselves merely prophetic predictions of this propaganda made by Roman emperors that I went to my co-author's house late at night, knocking on his windows, waking him up, and we spent the rest of the night, well past dawn, discussing all the implications and reading the New Testament. Because once you see it from that perspective, suddenly the whole New Testament looks like Roman propaganda.
Oof, James. Listen, this is amazing. You're gonna sit there? You ever watch Joe Dirt? Okay, it just makes me think of that funny moment when Joe Dirt rolls up to the guy who's selling fireworks. He only sells two types: snakes and sparklers. And he's like, "Hold on,
the lowest worst, right?
You're gonna stand there and tell me you're selling fireworks and you don't have whisker do's and whisker don'ts? Okay, you're telling me that Josephus, the one that full preterist and partial preterist run to show biblical fulfillment in this destruction of Jerusalem, yet they don't borrow what Josephus claimed was the fulfillment. They say everything about, Josephus said, yes, and Josephus admits Jesus' prophecy came true. Josephus says it's Vespasian. Does that not ring serious bells? And also, just to get on my question, I'm supposed to ask because it's super important. Is this a conspiracy theory? Jesus said he would return soon. Was he lying? Is Jesus something of a sort of a blend in the Gospels? Because Josephus seems to be saying Vespasian, while Christians are saying, or full preterists are saying, Jesus did come back. Look at Josephus. But look at Josephus, right?
Yes, you ask an excellent question there, Darren. Derek, and you've just put it together brilliantly. Josephus reports a rather remarkable thing as an eyewitness. Now, remember, Josephus is there as an eyewitness, he claims, to the fall of Jerusalem. In fact, he has an interchange himself with the rebels at the walls. So what Jesus is reporting is presumably what everyone is saying and seeing and what he saw, but which is rather incredible, that there were armies seen around Jerusalem fighting in the clouds. Now, this would seem to be a mention of Daniel, a prophet who at least was written by the 2nd or 3rd century BC, if not earlier, parts of it. So the point is this much earlier Jewish prophecy of a Messiah is being directly referred to by Josephus as heralding the fall of Jerusalem. Now, of course, Josephus believes in a Messiah. He thinks that it's Daniel's fulfillment. This means the coming of the Son of Man in glory and power. And Josephus does have a Messiah in mind. He tells us so. Vespasian. So for Josephus the Jew, who tells us he's still worshiping the Jewish God and believes in the Jewish prophecies, this vision in the clouds directly portends the arrival of Vespasian as the Son of Man coming in glory. Now, what's very interesting, he's a God-man. What's very interesting is that Jesus gives it precisely the same timing, both the vision of armies in the clouds, the Son of Man arising, coming in glory and power in the clouds, and associating that with the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, just as Josephus had. So scholars are able to date Jesus' apocalypse by means of Josephus' description of the event. And for Josephus, it meant Vespasian was the Messiah, so why didn't it mean the same thing to Jesus? Unless Jesus got it wrong.
Well, that would be the conclusion, wouldn't it? If we were to doubt the New Testament. But it means, as you said earlier, that this uncircumcised pagan Vespasian is the Jewish Messiah. Now, just hold that in your brain for a moment. I remember I used to read this newspaper back in my hometown. It was called the Jewish Free Press, and the biggest advertiser in there was Corky's Barbecue, that that sold obviously non-kosher foods. And I couldn't figure out why in the world were they the biggest advertiser in a Jewish newspaper. That's the same thing on a different scale as Vespasian being the Jewish Messiah.
Very much so. Very much so. One cannot imagine Vespasian keeping any of the distinctive requirements of the Mosaic Law.
Correct. And James, it's at so many different levels. As Derek knows, and you do too, I study the esoteric, and one of the things I look at is the numerical values of phrases that are embedded in the text. And here's Daniel talking about the coming in the clouds, as you said. Okay, coming in the clouds. And then Daniel 12 talks about blessed is he who waits and comes to the wrapping up of it all. And he calls it the 1335 days. So there's this association of the number 1335 with coming in the clouds. And when Jesus is talking to the high priest, he says the Son of Man is coming with clouds. And the value, the numerical value in the New Testament now of coming with clouds is 1335, because it carries forth what was in Daniel. And what you're saying is that same idea of coming in the clouds once again surfaces with Josephus as being all important.
It is clear that both Jesus in the Jesus apocalypse of the Synoptics and that Josephus in his description are both making direct reference to Daniel, and they're both making direct reference to Daniel in a way that is unique within Hebrew thought. Hebrew thought expected a Messiah. The Son of Man, which just means man in the original to Daniel, was just a symbolic thing, just like all his other beasts and his visions were. To Daniel, who was a strict monotheist, the vision of the Son of Man is simply the coming of the rule of the people. He represents symbolically the people that would come to rule the world and conquer all the nations. And he was associated, yes, with the Messianic Advent as well. But to Hebrews, of course, that does not mean a God-man. What is unique to both Jesus and to Josephus is that it is both the fulfillment of Daniel and that they are both talking about a God-man. Something totally unique to Jewish thought up to that moment.
And then the next question I'd like to give to Luther, but I just kind of want to emphasize what you just said, because you already simplify it, but I'm going to take it to those who might really need to let this sink in. You're suggesting, and the evidence is supporting, that this God-man, which is a pagan idea, this is far from a Jewish concept, is incorporated in the New Testament. Josephus tends to give leniency to this concept of a God-man by saying, here's the Messiah, here's the God-man, Vespasian, because you can't say Vespasian is the Messiah and disregard what he claims himself to be, wouldn't you say? He claimed to be a god, correct?
Josephus is claiming to be a Jew. And he is insisting as he goes over, he in fact gives us his prayer as he goes over to the Romans. Since God has gone over to the Romans, since it has pleased you, God, to show favor to the Romans, I'll go over to them not as a traitor, but as a minister to thee, God. So for Josephus, he's still a good, loyal Jew. So it's very difficult. It's even more difficult. See, even contemporary Roman inhibitions prevented them from calling a living man a god in the city of Rome. Those inhibitions for monotheists were, of course, much stronger. So Josephus never comes out and tells us that his employer, Vespasian, is in fact a god-man. However, he cannot be blind to the fact that all good Roman emperors are deified in their lifetimes. Moreover, Josephus is writing at about the same time as the pagan Roman who was a friend of the Flavians, Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder is the author of a comprehensive survey of ancient science in the ancient world, and he's an important writer from the first century, but a pagan scientific writer. But he dedicates his work to his friends, the Flavian emperors, and he already associates the charity and the benevolence of the Flavian emperors with their divinity, even when they're still alive. So even pagan Romans were aware during the lifetime of Vespasian that he was a more than mortal being. And it is impossible for me to consider an official propagandist for the Flavians like Josephus, unaware of the fact that his employer is advertising himself and will shortly advertise himself after his death as an official god. Of course, Flavius wrote his later works long after the deifications of both Vespasian and Titus. By then, they were gods as well as messiahs to Josephus.
So Vespasian was not just a terrestrial man; he was a celestial God, and of course there are layers of that in the Jewish world, the Greek influence world. I'm thinking of astrotheology. I'm thinking about a time when Egypt dominated the Mesopotamian basin, the area. After that, Babylon. And these were all associated with certain ages, certain astrological ages. In the age of Taurus, it was Egypt. In the age of Aries, separated by 2,000 years, it was Babylon. Now we're coming up upon the age of Pisces. It's the age of the fish. And those that studied astrotheology were well aware of it. So the fish was important as a symbol of the time. And you get into that. You discuss symbology. That's crucial to your work. Tell us something about this symbol of the fish, and particularly it's a dolphin. Tell us something about this. Well, I'll let you take it from there. I'll let you tell us something about the symbol and its importance.
It's a very complex symbol, and it has actually a couple of important uses and origins in the ancient world, and its meanings become very esoteric once it becomes a symbolic thing for the Christians. But if we can take it back to its original meaning, according to Greek mythology, the god Apollo transferred himself at a certain stage, and this is in Homer, one of the oldest of the Greek authors. Apollo transferred himself into into a fish, the dolphin. The dolphin was considered a fish by most ancients. Not Aristotle, who knew better, but most ancients regarded the dolphin as just one another of the fish. In fact, the king of the fish. And so the dolphin was closely associated with the healing god Apollo. And on the island of Delos, which is the legendary birthplace of the god Apollo, one can see the fish and the anchor symbol, sort of a dolphin entwined around an anchor, as the leading, if not the exclusive, symbol for Apollo on that island. And that goes back centuries BC. And in fact, it was that association of the dolphin with the god Apollo, who was interestingly both the god of prophecy and truth and the god of healing to the Greeks, as well as being, a third thing, a solar deity, a sun god, a god of light. Well, this god became important to early Greek conquerors of what is today Syria, the Seleucids. They regarded themselves as descendants of Apollo, and so they adopted the very same anchor and fish motif as their own. Thereafter, the anchor and fish itself sort of went out as a symbol, although the anchor by itself was continued to be used in coins, say, of the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom of the 2nd, 1st centuries BC. There are also Jewish connections to the fish symbol. And this, of course, goes back to the story of Jonah. Jonah, of course, tried to resist the will of God and did not go to the city of Nineveh to convert the sinners of Nineveh as God wanted him to. And God sent a storm. When he headed in the other direction, God sent a storm to the ship. And realizing this, Jonah said, "Knock me off the boat. Throw me off the boat, guys." And he did. And he was, of course, taken into the belly of a great fish for 3 days. 3 days, just like Jesus. And when he was expelled from the fish, he finally obeyed God, went to Nineveh, and helped the people of Nineveh, which is interestingly a foreign place. So fish symbolism both has a messianic connection, a connection to resisting the will of God and then going to convert people in a foreign city. That's within Jewish literature. But perhaps even more significantly, the dolphin and fish image itself was closely associated with both Apollo and with the Seleucid Greek kings of the Hellenistic era. And then again, after centuries more, the dolphin and anchor symbol became uniquely the symbol of the Emperor Titus, the very son of Vespasian, who completed the conquest of Jerusalem and thereby fulfilling the Jesus apocalypse. It's very strange that minted in the thousands, in the millions, coins with the face of Titus on one side and coins with the anchor and fish image on the other were printed. And those coins were still in circulation when the anchor and fish image early in the 2nd century, after it had been discontinued by Roman emperors, became the principal symbol of Jesus Christ in the earliest catacombs.
This is wild. I mean, look, it sounds to me you should work on Forensic Files, the show, and just connect all the dots, James. You know, you'd get everybody caught because they'd be like, hold on, there's no hiding anything from this guy. It seems so clear when I hear you repeat this because we've had our talks. Look, we've talked on the phone. Me and Luther and you, we've three-wayed. We've had these communications. We've read. I am almost done with your book. I have not been
That sounds almost kinky. I have to stop you there. That sounds almost kinky. It's been totally intellectual and platonic. No 3 ways have been involved. I want to promise my wife that.
Oh, time out. No, I'm just kidding.
I figured it was time for a little comic relief.
That was definitely, yeah, man. That was kind of crazy there because you know the Romans had some crazy stuff going on in the streets.
Well, there was few things the Romans would not do that way.
Look, I find it really cool because we've been talking about this and you are connecting some dots. We're getting into the coinage. We're showing the image, okay, on the coin. There's a lot of image discussion throughout the Bible as well, but and with the coinage. But I find it interesting before we go deeper into the coin, all right, because right now we need to keep that on the forefront. It seems it goes right into Titus, right there with Vespasian, and what happens? The Christians adopt this same symbolism. But before we rabbit trail too far into that, I want you to give some examples in the text, because a lot of these people who might be listening are probably textual Christians. Well, the Bible interprets the Bible, okay, and you're going to show these guys in the text what red flags. All right, what Roman propaganda? Give some clear implications why this is a Roman text and not what first century Jew or the Messianic Jew. You can kind of touch on what the Messianic Jews thought of and why we know this is Roman propaganda, if you don't mind.
Right. It's clear that the first century rebels were not amenable to Hellenistic Greek ideas and Roman ideas. They were strict adherents to their own Hebrew literature, especially the Torah and the words of the prophets. When we look at Dead Sea Scrolls documents, for example, it's the prophets and the Torah that are the main concern, the most copies we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls of Hebrew Scriptures. But the sectarian documents themselves, whether they were written in the 2nd or 1st century BC, or whether they were written, as Professor Eisenman says, in the 1st century AD, really doesn't matter. We do know that religious extremists among the Hebrews were extremely sectarian, were extremely militant, and were extremely Torah orthodox. Apparently the sectarians of the Dead Sea Scrolls thought that even the Jewish temple that was still run by Jewish priests had become corrupt. But this idea goes all the way back, as I say, into Hebrew literature. It is the corrupting, polluting influence of foreign gods, the foreign wives of kings, and the corrupting influence of foreign culture that is the primary motivation for the Hasmonean revolt of the 2nd century BC. It is the attitude of Ezra when he comes back to found the Second Temple. We can only imagine that the Jewish rebels themselves had a similar idea, that their strict adherence to Torah required political independence, that their loyalty to the Jewish God was inconsistent with the requirements of Roman law. What's really interesting in the New Testament is that Jesus and Paul appear to be turning that philosophy inside out and on its head. Nothing could be more diametrically opposed to a nationalist view of Jewish exceptionalism, that we are God's chosen people, and that Jews and only Jews are allowed. This Israel-only idea was the idea of the Jewish rebels. It is the idea of previous Hebrew literature. It is the Hebrew prophecy that predicts a military Messiah, not a God Messiah, because they're monotheists, but a military Messiah who would come, and a man, not a God. So what we see in the New Testament literature is something radically, radically different. The Messiah is not a king at all. He's not a military leader at all. He, if anything, he models slave behavior, say in washing the feet of the disciples. If anything, he is a pacifist. When he runs across a Roman centurion, for example, and Matthew is the most clear about this, which is a very Jewish gospel, by the way. Matthew is most clear about this. When a centurion asks him for a healing, Jesus declares that this faith of this centurion exceeds that of any son of Israel. Period. There is no Jew whose faith apparently comes to equal terms with this, not only foreigner, not only Roman, but a Roman soldier in this age of Jewish rebellion. That would be like, say, an American GI being praised by a Muslim cleric as having Islamic faith that exceeded any Muslim. It would have the same sort of political implications in the first century. But Jesus, of course, does not stop there. Jesus, all over the place, is critical of the Mosaic law, starting with kosher diet. It's nothing that you put into your body that defiles. It's what comes out of your body that defiles, which is kind of a gross metaphor, but a very clear one. There are no unclean foods. And when Jesus, for example, is approached about whether one should pay taxes, they say, hey, there's a question, should we pay the tax to Rome? Well, Jesus says, show me the coin, show me the money. Now, in Jewish law at the time, as many Christians know, Roman pagan money could not be used for religious purposes at all. When you went to buy a sacrifice at the temple, you would have to exchange Roman money, which often had Roman emperors or pagan gods on them. That's unclean, that's pollution, that's an idol in violation of the Mosaic Ten Commandments. It would have to be exchanged for pure, clean, religiously okay money. To Romans and outsiders, of course, it must have seemed like a ripoff because they were charging a simple fee for the exchange. And that is precisely, of course, the criticism that Jesus brings to them. This whole money-changing idea is a ripoff. You've turned it into a den of thieves. In any case, when Jesus is asked about the money, he says, show me this polluted money. He touches the polluted money. In other words, he's affronting the Jewish purity laws themselves. Furthermore, when Jesus talks about it, he says, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to the things that are God's to God's. That is the very thing that the Jewish rebels of that moment were saying could not be done, that the needs of the Jewish God were inconsistent with Roman rule. Jesus is saying, no, the Jewish rebels are wrong. One can be both a loyal Jew and do everything that Caesar requires of us. Let's take it further. One of the oldest sections of the New Testament is written by Paul. One of the genuine Pauline epistles is Romans. In Romans chapter 13, he devotes basically the entire chapter to explaining how the Roman government are not just, it's not just a matter of advice. It's probably practical and a good idea to get along with the Roman state and to obey most Roman laws. No, Paul goes well beyond that. Paul says that the government are nothing less than God's appointed agents on earth. That disobedience to them is disobedience to God. That rebellion is a sin, and that this is why we pay our taxes. Standard Christian argumentation says, well, early Christians simply didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to create any trouble with the Roman Empire. Well, we're also told that they were willing to die rather than say that the emperor was God. Which is it? In any event, what's being said in the New Testament goes well beyond any effort to merely not rock the boat or to get along and go along. What they're saying is the Roman government are God's appointed agents on earth. When Jesus praises the centurion's faith as exceeding that of any contemporary Jew, he's going well beyond any, mere let's get along with the Romans attitude, You rebels are wrong, Jesus is saying in no uncertain terms. He is further saying to the Israel-only crowd, you are wrong. When he goes on about the centurion, he explains that the Jews themselves will experience much suffering, while many nations will come and sit at the table with Abraham. But perhaps the place where we find the Roman fingerprints the most glaring in the New Testament is in the Passion narrative. The central narrative of all four Gospels is the events leading to and the events surrounding the execution of Jesus. It occupies most of the time of the Gospels. But let's break the story apart. Despite what everyone is told by Hollywood, that and in recent days we've been given on all the television channels all the greatest story ever told, movies and stuff, and Hollywood has definitely turned the Roman government into the heavies. Well, this is definitely not the attitude of the New Testament. The Romans are not the heavies. The Jews are the heavies in the New Testament, and that's unmistakable. There is a clear political agenda to the New Testament, and is perhaps most clearly revealed in that Passion narrative. It is not Romans with whom Jesus is arguing, but throughout the Gospels, his rhetorical foils are various Jewish authorities, Pharisees, Sadducees, priests, scribes. And his arguments are about the Mosaic Law. You guys are sticklers for the Mosaic Law, sticklers for the Sabbath, sticklers for, purity laws. Well, that's all wrong, guys. Well, the priests are obviously getting a little more and more and more upset. In fact, all the various Jewish authorities must be getting upset. And Jesus climaxes these rhetorical jousts with a direct attack on the temple in Jerusalem itself. He morally attacks the purity laws. He attacks the temple morally by saying it's a den of thieves, justifying the Roman conquest, which is soon to come. And he actually physically commences a physical attack on the temple, which is the Romans are shortly to complete. Now,
and the temple, yeah. And the
no,
temple,
stop
James,
me, please, yeah.
No, and the temple being the absolute epicenter of Jewish life.
It was the one place where animal sacrifices could be done. You could not properly kill the Passover lamb, but at the temple. It was the duty of every Jewish male at least once to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem.
Wow.
Under the Mosaic Law, holocausts of animal sacrifices are required, and that requires the temple.
Okay, so James, you've got this distinction, and you are bringing it out thoroughly between these two kinds of Jews, between these two kinds, and even on to Christians as the Reformation of Judaism, that you had the militant Messianics on one hand, and on the other hand, the meek and mild Messianics, which we see in the New Testament, the writings of Paul and Josephus, and that perspective. And in the book, you use Trajan, Nero, Josephus, the scriptures themselves, and even the Dead Sea Scrolls to ratify these distinctions. And they were true not just in the days of Jesus's ministry, but in the Passion narrative, you could see the distinction. And you could see it in the prophecy about eschatology, the final coming of Jesus, in every stage.
All of it. You know, Luther, I play a game with especially my Christian friends, is put your finger down at random anywhere in the New Testament, and I will explain to you how it is inverting the rebel philosophy and how it is Roman propaganda. And it really can be done anywhere. You can put your finger down just about at random, with the exception, say, the letter of James, ascribed to James, and we can maybe discuss that later. But pretty much at random in the New Testament, you could just drop your finger down, and I can explain to you why the Romans would have put it there.
Look, guys, before my head explodes, okay, I think it's extremely important that we rabbit trail into this topic into our next segment. But first, guys, get the book. This book, where's my book at? This book right here, Creating Christ, is extremely valuable. It's important. It carries a lot of information you won't find anywhere else. And the authors do a really good job of making it easily to understand. It's really easy. It doesn't take a long time. It's about 400 pages long, but it's valuable information filled with pictures. For people like me who don't like reading too many words, this is perfect, let me tell you. Look, you can get it right here. It's popping up on the screen. This is his book. This is where you can find it on Amazon. Make sure you guys get it. Put it in your cart. Buy the book. It'll be mailed shortly. You got to read it. You will enjoy this book. It's unbelievable. Even Dr. Eisenman gives it scholarly credentials. So, Luther, would you like to tag on that?
Derek, the book is worth it in every respect. It's even affordable. I'm looking at an offer here on the inside cover. It says that Crossroads Press, that puts out the book, offers digital, audio, print formats. This book is available in Kindle. It's available in paperback. Is it available in hardback also?
Yes, trade paperback, Kindle, ebook.
Kindle, ebook, all of that. And then there's an offer here I just want to mention. It says enter the code FIRSTBOOK, just like it sounds, FIRSTBOOK, and get 20% off your first order from the wide world of Crossroad Press. So it's affordable in every respect, folks. You can't afford not to get this book. We recommend it without reservation.
Couldn't agree more. CreatingChrist.com. No spaces, no caps, no nothing. It's CreatingChrist.com. You check them out here. You see it on your screen. This is their website. You got to tune in, get involved, help support these guys if you believe in this project and what is going on, especially after you read the book. If it's not convincing, we probably need to let you reread the book because it's got a lot in there. It's not easy to just pass away all this evidence. Something has to be explained here, guys, and we're on something epic. Until next time, Myth Vision Radio Podcast, Luther.
Next time, you don't think we're going to let James go just with one show, do you? Join us next time. He'll be back with us for more thrill-packed
With
adventures.
pleasure, gentlemen. With pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Great having you.
All right.